Welcome back to the Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. We are glad to have Matt Vereen and Dr. Bryan Denham here with us to continue our conversation about building sports communities through media. We talked in the first part of the episode about general topics around sports journalism, kind of understanding what it is, where it's positioned, and what it can do. Now let's look at some of the specifics. How does the media address issues of substance use in sports and society?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're unavoidable. I mean, just look at the Olympics right now that are going on. Doping has constantly been a discussion point there. It's happening right now with Russian athletes and in ice skating right now. I believe there's a 15-year-old who won gold for the team competition, and she was found to have failed her doping test, as far as, which is something Russia's consistently had an issue with. It's the reason they have to go by the Russian Olympic Committee, ROC, right now in the Olympics, as opposed to being called Russia as other countries would. But of course, you're talking about a 15-year-old. There are rules about whether a 15-year-old can be held accountable for a failed doping test because they couldn't have made that decision themselves. It was something that was put on them by the leadership of the team. So these are things that they're unavoidable in the Olympics. You also look at DUIs would technically fall under substance abuse, and athletes all the time are in the news for a DUI or for drug abuse and things like this, though I would say the media a lot of times probably covers it a little closer to TMZ than they should by talking specifically about the headline of it, athlete pulled over for DUI, rather than talking about the larger issues and impacts and trends that these are simply, just an element of, and finding solutions to these issues that are clearly prevalent within the sports world.
Yes, I had mentioned that that 1970 series I was studying in Sports Illustrated, and one of the reasons I decided to do that is to look at how, when there's this big story in the magazine, what are the patterns that follow it? And sure enough, just like in the 21st century with the Sports Illustrated expose on baseball, this one prompted a couple of politicians to demand that sports clean up their act. They held hearings, and even within hearings, you can find a familiar cast of characters when they get hauled in to talk before Congress. So there are some patterns. What bothers me sometimes is that even when there's a great sports series. For example, the New York Times, I believe in 2012 or 13, did a great series on abuses in horse racing. And they really laid it all out there and just lots of articles and great reporting. And horse racing, they had the hearings and everything, and they were going to clean up their act. But if you're following the news now, you can look at the one racetrack in Los Angeles that has horse death after horse death, and nothing has changed in that respect. Trainers are still having their credentials questioned, and so it's the same story over and over, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and I'm so appreciative, Bryan, that you're bringing that historical perspective. We've had other guests on our show that bring a perspective based in history, whether it's an educational trend or it's a sports journalism trend, whatever it may be. Unfortunately, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And so it does seem like some of these stories are cropping back up again. And Matt, you were talking about the Russian doping thing, and, this is not new. So you hear that.
It's actually quite fascinating. The last Russian doping scandal in Sochi, that was in part to make sure that the Russian athletes excelled such that Putin would be more popular, and therefore people there would support invading Ukraine. And he would have this popularity, and that's exactly what happened, right? They invaded Ukraine. Now it's a little different story, but Ukraine is back in the news again with Russian troops there. So he doesn't have the power he did to mobilize opinion of him then, but still, it's a fascinating story.
Can I just jump back to something else? I hadn't thought about this in terms of politics, particularly in some other countries. But I remember when I was living in Guatemala in 2011 or 12, and they were hosting a presidential race. And Guatemala is the only Central American country that hasn't sent a team to the World Cup. So one of the presidential candidates made the center point of his campaign, I'll get Guatemala to the World Cup. Now, how the president of a country does that was never really clear, but that was a big part of his campaign. He came in second in the presidential race, and there were 8 or 10 candidates. Yeah. I mean, it really did influence that election in a big way. And you think about other places around the world. I think there was a book even on soccer and how it was something like How Soccer Explains the World.
Oh, yeah.
That a journalist did. And a lot of it had to do with the politics related to soccer and how much it influences the campaigns, elections, economies, conflict, things like that.
And has a history in religion as well, with Catholics playing against Protestants and so forth. So it's a fascinating game with a very rich history to it. And the rivalries in Europe in particular are fierce.
I would just like to hear his plan for doing that, because aside from wiping out the United States and Mexico from the CONCACAF, I don't know how you're going to get that country in there.
That's right.
Yeah, I think a lot of us wanted to hear that plan, and we're rather thankful that he didn't slide all the way into the presidency. But
Exactly.
Ooh. Oh my goodness. Well, let's go down this road just a little bit further and think about how, just like with these current Olympics that we're in right now, we've had a lot of sports journalism talking about the location of where the Olympics are even being held right now, and how this is being presented with a nod to some human rights. And Matt, you touched it a little bit about even getting into sports journalism and why we need to maybe see some more of that diversity. So what do you think, Bryan? How are sports journalists able to tap into this a little bit?
Many sports journalists are part of larger corporations who may or may not have an interest in being highly critical of the system of government in some land. There's all kinds of business, for example, with China. And a lot of people have pointed to human rights abuses there, and that the Olympics shouldn't have been there. But depending on who the sports journalist works for, that person may see a story, slightly edited, let's say, or encouraged to cover a different angle, just because of outside pressures. There's supposed to be a wall there. There should be autonomy for sports journalists, like all journalists, to report. But the reality is that's a touchy subject, and there's more at stake. But sport incidents have caused international incidents. So Matt probably can think of a few of those.
Yeah. So, what you're talking about, we would refer to in the business as the separation of church and state. Yeah. And the sales department and the journalists are supposed to be two separate entities who have almost no interaction with each other, no matter what. We, literally, at my last station, they were on the second level and we were on the first level of the building, and they weren't allowed to walk into the newsroom because they didn't want any level of interaction there. But as that is a local television station, like Bryan's talking about, at higher levels, it becomes a bit different. You look at ESPN is owned by Disney Corporation. Well, for quite a while, they have broadcasted the Little League World Series. These are kids from across the world playing baseball. Well, the kids from Taiwan are not allowed to be called Taiwan in the Little League World Series. They're called Chinese Taipei when they compete in that. That is specifically an initiative to not upset China. There are a lot of those. The bigger the company gets, the more exerted pressure they have. And granted, the broadcasting of a game isn't as much of the journalism that we would be referring to as far as the checks on human rights that would happen elsewhere. But I think they're unavoidable. Credit to NBC and their coverage. A lot of journalists' eyes were on them when they opened this Olympic coverage, of whether they would even talk about it at all. And it was the very first thing they talked about when the Olympic coverage started, was the human rights issues. And I don't think a lot of people were expecting that. So it's not as if it doesn't ever happen, but they're certainly fighting a lot of pressure from the parental company when they do that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I for one, was a little bit shocked. I can remember some of the sports journalists that were reporting, especially on some of the chess matches between some of the chess players. And I know we probably don't think about chess being a sport like soccer, but it's highly competitive and huge story to think about how the players were pitted in countries for specific reasons, just like you were saying, Bryan. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it's hard to talk about issues around sports and journalism without talking about the elephant in the room, COVID. You mentioned this earlier, Matt, but let's kind of expand on it. How's COVID affected or affecting sports reporting?
You mean aside from the fact that we're doing this on Zoom right now? I mean, everything that we're doing is impacted by it. I remember the day it mainly hit, I was set to interview a basketball team over in Springfield, Missouri, Drury University. Their women's team was ranked #1 in the country, were undefeated, the best team, and were by far the favorites to win the first ever women's national championship for that school. So I was there on the day that it was announced that no fans were going to be allowed to these games. So I show up to the arena to interview the team after practice when I see a coach wander into the practice looking very upset. And that's when I check my phone and realize that no longer are no fans going to be allowed there. They've canceled the tournament entirely. And you could hear a pin drop in that arena as players started coming out just in tears. And you learned a certain level of respect for being in that moment. I dropped my camera to the ground. I didn't film it at all because it wasn't a moment that should have been captured. It started impacting everything from there. As sports were shut down to now, even as we pick it back up, most press conferences are done like this on Zoom. A lot of interviews are done. And that can be a good thing. A lot of times if someone is unreachable, I can't get to them, the ability to interview them on Zoom is a very useful tool. But at the same time, you're looking at the quality of that interview maybe drops. There's less ability to do a check on someone in power over a Zoom interview. That's not something that's very easy to do. You've also seen it in just the coverage of sports. There's a lot less reporter traveling going on. For instance, if you watch a Major League Baseball game recently, odds are the play-by-play people calling that game aren't actually at the game if their team is the away team. They're probably calling it remotely, which means that they're not there to actually talk to the players, to talk to the coaches, to get a feel for the emotion that's behind the sports, because it's gone into a far more of a remote coverage through things like Zoom. And that can be good and bad. And I think a lot of us within the business are hoping that on the other side of this, we go back to in-person, though I think a lot of universities and teams would be okay with it staying here to have that certain level of security and wall that stays between the two.
There's definitely that wall there. They can simply press on to the next reporter. Of course, some coaches have always done that. If they get a question they don't like, they attempt to embarrass the reporter in front of his peers and start asking the reporter questions or what have you. But one of the things that I've been interested in when it first occurred, when COVID first happened, was the influence of athletes on demanding that their sports play anyway. This happened in college football. And it always amazed me that 18-year-olds would have such a commanding presence in sort of shaming leagues into playing. And it created all kinds of problems the one year where the Big Ten, I believe, started late in their football games. They had these bizarre records for the postseason, like 4-1 or something, and what to do, right? And who deserved to go to the playoff. And journalists they reported it. It was there. Here's what happened. But from a persuasion standpoint, it struck me as unfortunate. And here we are, parents showing up at the Big Ten office and demanding to see the commissioner. And those stories, they got reported. But a lot of people said, good for them, without any concern whatsoever that this could be a fairly serious virus. And we should probably think it through before just securing your entertainment for the evening. Wow,
these are excellent points. Yeah, I can definitely hear the both and in the benefits of, yes, we don't have to travel. we can report on something, but yet having this other negativity is definitely a withdrawal. I mean, I love listening to Clemson football on the radio. I prefer rather than watching the game. So having somebody with that enthusiasm broadcasting and being remote, I don't know if they would get the same level of enthusiasm like what Matt was saying, So I do hope that there will be some return without some of the negativity.
I imagine you didn't have as much enthusiasm about this past season for Clemson football, though. It's maybe the years before.
Hey, we're all allowed a hiccup. It's okay. It's just
That's right.
Just a hiccup. All right. You touched a little bit on this, Bryan, in our earlier episode about commercialization of sports and how that affects sports writing and broadcasting. And you even used the word celebrity because with celebrity, there's commercialization. You don't get to be a celebrity without selling something, whether, whatever product, from a bobblehead to a, can of Coke, whatever. So how does that impact what you all do as journalists?
Well, Matt might be, he's a practicing journalist. He might be able to shed some light on that. Were you discussing the role of celebrity?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's all kinds of degrees with commercialization. I think, first of all, that element of the digitalization and the commercialization combined have resulted in a wave of teams themselves investing a lot of resources in their own reporters and media groups and everything. And there are a lot of pros to that. A lot of these reporters that you'll find on Twitter who have a lot of the information on the team have a lot greater access because they're hired by the team. They're right there. They get the information first. But at the same time, you have to understand that they're not going to give you the bad information. They're only going to give you the good stuff. There's a wall of bias there that you won't be able to overcome. But at the same time, that's the source of all this growing, jobs that are within sports journalism in that digital sphere is they're not in traditional journalism. They haven't studied that journalism degree. They're just people who can make a good video and make an enticing thing for consumption. So you have to have a certain level of a consumer of knowing who you're getting it from. On the other side of journalism, I think that, as we talked about earlier, as the profits have been less and less with digitalization, commercialization has increased. And so that wall of church and state that I referenced earlier has eroded more and more. I know that in a previous job of mine, I won't say which one, but I was told by our sales team and our news director had gotten together, and I was forced every Saturday to run a 30-second piece that was sponsored, with a viewer submitted photo of a hunter and their trophy of the week. And it was sponsored by a local company. I, at that time, was about to leave for my next job, so I didn't personally fight it. Had I been there longer, those kinds of things are a real problem. That native content element of these sponsored deals that, in my opinion, aren't even really sports, but they make a certain amount of money for the company, which is all these traditional medias are just trying to stay afloat in any way they can. So there are a lot of positives with the commercialization of sports, and there are also a lot of negatives, especially within the realm of journalism.
Okay, but Matt, before I have to know, what was one of the examples of the trophies?
It's I had to show a guy who was holding a deer he had shot, and let's just say he hadn't cleaned this deer before he took the photo. So I literally talked to my sports director and was like, and we both agreed, like, there are kids watching the news. Like, showing a bloody carcass doesn't feel like a great thing. And it was something they had wanted months before that we had presented that to them. And they said, you know what, that's a good thought. We won't do it. And then a few months later, there was no discussion. It was just, hey, you're doing this starting this Saturday. Here's the photo you're running this week. And so they've gotten a bit sneakier about, at that point, now we don't have a choice. It's already been approved. And we're contractually obligated as us with my company. But these are things that, we fight when we can and we don't. And they're just things that consumers should be aware of when they see them.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing.
What effect are independent podcasters having on?
Yeah.
Well, they're dragging me on the podcast like this one a little more. No, it's good. I think that podcasts have opened up discussions and have exposed a lot of journalists. A lot of times I'm condensed, for instance, on weeknights, I have like 3 minutes in a television and local news for sports. Very difficult to condense the complexity of sports journalism into me talking for 30 seconds and then a 30-second soundbite from a coach or an athlete. Yeah. Podcasts and elements like this are far more long-standing. You're able to more explain the complexities that surround these issues and bring on voices that wouldn't have had access otherwise. So I think it's a great movement.
Mm-hmm. You know, one aspect of commercialization as well that people have to realize when they go into particularly sports broadcasting is if they're women, there's going to be a good bit of sexualization of them. And if you choose to go into the profession, you almost have to realize that you may end up on a top 10 list of the hottest, quote, hottest sports broadcasters. And some people choose to use that, which is fine by me. They're saying, hey, if that's what is going to increase my ratings or whatever, or make me popular, and I'm going to use that. Others would say, no, that's ridiculous. I don't want to be known for being a hot sportscaster. I want to be known for being a competent sportscaster. But it's a reality, some would be on a magazine cover. And there was a lot of resentment in the sports world years ago when the tennis player Anna Kournikova made so much money doing calendars and so forth because she was simply physically attractive. She had never won a major tournament. And a lot of people resented that. And so commercialization, she just chose to exploit her own sexuality and made a fortune. She wasn't a journalist, but some have chosen that route. And that's their prerogative. I don't necessarily blame them.
Matt, do you think you're going to get on a list of the top 50 hottest sports journalists this year? If you do, share that with us, okay?
If I do, my mom will be so proud. She'll have that printed out in an instant. But I think that, as much as I would love that, like Bryan's talking about, there are definitely negatives to it as well. Nothing has disgusted me more in my life than reading the emails and inbox messages that certain female coworkers of mine have received. They are a despicable thing that I think goes back to a previous thing we talked about in missing perspectives in journalism. No one should have to endure that just to do a job that they want to do that in lots of cases pays $30,000 a year. I mean, the number of people who are weeded out based solely on that. I know plenty of friends I've had who have quit the business because they could not go through that end of it and the other end of you're a woman, you shouldn't be speaking in the realm of men's sports. There are a lot of things that are going on as there's more access to journalists and this commercialization, the digitalization, it's all interconnected, and some of it is positive and a lot of it is negative. And finding solutions to these things is something we should look into, but they're certainly by no means simple solutions.
Well said, Matt.
All right, we have one final question. What's a metaphor to help us better understand sports journalism?
Let Matt take that one. I'm trying to think of one earlier, and there are several that could apply, but Matt, do you have one?
I would say the number one thing is that to lay a foundation to this, there is not as much difference between news journalism and sports journalism as people like to emphasize. They are both one and the same. Sports journalism is news journalism. But to draw a metaphor around it, I suppose, a traditional news reporter is like the medicine. I guess if I use like, it's a simile and not a metaphor. Traditional news journalism is the medicine that you force feed to a dog that doesn't want it. It is important and integral to them being well-rounded consumers and members of a civilization. They need that medicine. Sports journalism is wrapping a piece of cheese around that medicine. On the outside, it's an escape, it's a treat, it's more hospitable, but beneath it, it should still be the same thing. It needs to serve the same purposes and attack the same stories, just within a slightly different realm in order to keep up that same, if it's not that, then it's not journalism. And that's the key difference, I would say.
And as we've talked about, many of the issues are the same. Substance use, labor law, lots of different kinds of subjects emerge in sports journalism that also emerge in mainstream news, and they need to be covered. And so, yes, there's probably it used to be called the toy department, sports newsrooms, but I don't think that necessarily applies when you're talking about real hard-hitting journalists, and they are out there. There's some outstanding features on Bryant Gumbel's show, for example, Real Sports. I've seen some excellent features on, say, exploitation of Mount Everest or what have you. And so there's good work out there. The question is, do people want to see it? I believe The Athletic has very lofty goals, right? But it's struggling financially, isn't it? So there's lots of great reporting out there, but is it getting to people as much as some of the other stories that maybe are not as hard hitting?
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much. Bryan, where can folks learn more about your work or connect with you?
They can go to the Clemson University Department of Communication homepage, and has a list of some of the projects I've been interested in.
Great. Thank you. Matt, where can we connect with you or learn more about what you're doing?
Well, I guess first off, if you're in the Midlands of South Carolina, you can tune in to watch Fox Channel 57 and watch me there. I'm on TV most nights. Beyond that, find me on Twitter at Matt Vereen. I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. If you search up my name, you'll probably find me.
All right. Thank you very much, Matt and Bryan, for this conversation. Next week, we're going to be talking about sports accessibility.
Oh, that's going to be a fun conversation. I'm really excited about that one too.
Yeah, me too.
Bryan and Matt, this has been just delightful, I have to say. And I'm glad that we did a little deep dive into some of the backgrounds behind sports and sports journalism. This was fascinating. Thank you so much. We do want to ask you to leave us a review, rate us on Apple Podcasts, become a subscriber to theafterwordpodcast.com, because it does help us keep the conversations going. And as always, remember, you are welcome at our table.